The 0-Meter Diving Team by Shepard. Guilt, guilt, guilt. Here's what it's like to bear up under the burden of so much guilt. Everywhere you drag yourself, you leave a trail. Late at night, you gaze back and view an upsetting record of where you've been. At the medical center, where they brought my brothers, I stood banging my head against the corner of a crash cart. When one of the nurses saw me, I said, "There, that's better." That kills the thought before they grow. Hullabaloo. I am Boris Yakovlevich Prushinsky, Chief Engineer of the Department of Nuclear Energy, and my younger brother, Mikhail Vasilevich, was a senior turbine engineer serving reactor unit number 4 at the Chernobyl power station, on duty the night of 26 April 1986. Our half-brother, Petya, and his friend were there that same night, outside the reactor's cooling tower on the Pripyat River, fishing downwind. So you can see that our family was right in the thick of what followed. We were not, how shall we put it, very lucky that way. But then, like their country, the Prushinskis have always been first to protest that no one should waste any pity on them, because the Prushinskis have always made their own luck. The All-Prushinsky 0-Meter Diving Team. My father owns one photo of Mikhail, Petya, and myself together. It was taken by our mother. She was no photographer. The 3 of us are arranged by height on a dock over the river. We seem to be smelling something unpleasant. It's from the summer our father was determined to teach us proper diving form. He'd followed the Olympics from Mexico City on a radio, and the exploits of the East German fisher had filled him with ambition for his boys. But our dock had been too low, and so he'd called it the 0-Meter Diving Platform. The bottom, where we dove, was marshy and shallow, and frightened us. "What are you frightened of?" he said to us. "I'm not frightened." "Boris, are you frightened?" "I'm not frightened," I told him, for my brother knew I was. I was 10, and imagined myself his ally. Petya was 5, Mikhail was 7. Both are weeping in the photo, their hands on their thighs. Sometimes at night, when our mother was still alive, our father would walk the ridge above us to see the moon on the river, he said. He would shout off into the darkness. He was Viktor Grigorievich Prushinsky, director of the Physical Energy Institute. While she was alive, that was the way our mother, Mikhail's and my mother, introduced him. Petya's mother didn't introduce him to anyone. Officially, Petya was our full brother. But at home, our father called him Half-Life. He said it was a physicist's joke. "Give your brother your potatoes," he would order Petya, and poor little Petya would shovel his remaining potatoes on Mikhail's plate. During their fights, Mikhail would say to him things like, "Your hair seems different than ours, don't you think?" So there's a murderousness to our play. We went on rampages around the dacha, chopping each other with sticks and clearing swaths in the lilacs and wildflowers in mock battles. And our father would thrash us. He used an ash switch, 4 strokes for me, then 3 for Mikhail, and I was expected to apply the 4th, then 3 for Petya, and Mikhail was expected to apply the 4th. Our faces were terrible to behold. We always applied the final stroke, as though we wanted to outdo the first 3. When calm, he quoted to us Strugatsky's dictum, that reason was the ability to use the powers of the surrounding world without ruining the world. Striped with welts and lying on our bellies on our beds, we tinted his formulation with our own colorations of fury and misery. 25 years later, that same formulation would appear in my report to the Nuclear Power Secretary of the Central Committee concerning the catastrophic events at the power station of Chernobyl. Loss. Our mother died of the flu when I was 11. Petya lost his only protector and grew more disheveled and strange and full of difference. Mikhail, for a full year, carried himself as though he'd been petrified by a loud noise. Later we joked that she'd concocted the flu to get away, and she was off on a beach in the Black Sea. But every night we peeped at one another across the dark floor between our beds, vacant and alone. In the mornings, I took to cupping Mikhail's first fist with my palms when he was thumb-sucking, as though I were praying. It brought us nose to nose and made me shudder with an enraged tenderness. Petya sucked his thumb as well, interested. That warm night in April. What is there to say about the power station, or the river on which it sits? The Pripyat, just a few kilometers downstream, drains into the Dnieper, having snaked to land as level as a soccer pitch with a current the color of tea from the peat bogs nearby. In the deeper parts, it's cold year-round. For long stretches, it dips and loops around stands of young pines. Mikhail was pleased with the area when he settled there. He was a young Turo, the coming thing. At 28, a senior turbine engineer. There were 3 secondary schools, a young people's club, festive covered markets, a 2-screen cinema, and a children's world department store. Plenty of good walking trails and fishing. Petya followed him. Petya usually followed him from assignment to assignment, getting odd jobs, getting drunk, getting thrown in jail, getting bailed out of trouble by his brother, or half-brother. Why doesn't he ever follow you? Mikhail asked me the night Petya showed up on his doorstep yet again. Mikhail didn't call often. It was a bad connection that sounded like wasps in the telephone line. Petya was already asleep in the dining room. He'd walked the last 20 versts after having hitched a ride on a cement truck. They found him a little apartment in town and a job on the construction site for the spent fuel depository. As for a residence permit, for that, Mikhail told me on the phone, they'd rely on their big shot brother. I was ready to help out. We both treated Petya as though he had to be taught to swallow. Let me do that, we tell him, before it even commenced what he was attempting to do. Whatever went wrong in our lives, we'd still think they still weren't as fucked up as Petya's. Mikhail's shift came on duty at midnight, an hour and 25 minutes before the explosion. Most of the shift members did not survive until morning. Petya, I was told later, was fishing that night with another layabout, a friend. They'd chosen a little sandbar near the feeder channel across from the turbine hall, where the water released from the heat exchangers into the cooling pond was 20 degrees warmer. In spring, it filled with hatchlings. There was no moon, and it was balmy for April, and starry above the black shapes of the cooling waters. Earthenware pots. As chief engineer of the Department of Nuclear Energy, I was a mongrel, half technocrat, half bureaucrat. We knew there were problems in both design and operating procedures, but what industry didn't have problems? Our method was to get rid of them by keeping silent. Nepotism ruled the day. "Fat lot of good it's done for me," Mikhail often joked. If you tried to bring a claim against someone for incompetence or negligence, his allies hectored you, all indignation on his behalf. Everyone ended up shouting. No one got to the bottom of the problem, and he became a saboteur, someone seeking to undermine the achievement of the quotas. People said I owed my position to my father, and Mikhail owed his position to me. "More than they know," he said grimly when I told him that. At various congresses, I ran my concerns by my father. In response, he gave me that look Mikhail called the dick shriveler. "Why'd you dig big around him in the first place?" Petya once asked when he'd overheard us. We all lived under the doctrine of ubiquitous success. Negative information was reserved for the most senior leaders, with censored versions available for those lower down. Nothing instructive about precautions or emergency procedures could be organized, since such initiatives undermined the official position concerning the complete safety of the nuclear industry. For 30 years, accidents went unreported. Lessons derived from these accidents remained with those who'd experienced them. It was as if no accident had occurred. So who gave a shit if the Ministry of Energy was riddled through with incompetence and filled with the finest theorists? Whenever we came across a particular idiocy, in terms of staffing, we quoted to one another the old saying, "It doesn't take gods to bake earthenware pots." The year before, the chief engineer during the startup procedures at Balakovo had fucked up and 40 men had been boiled alive. The bodies had been retrieved and laid before him in a row. I had resisted his hiring. That, for me, constituted enough to quiet my conscience. And when Mikhail submitted an official protest about sanctioned shortcuts in one of his unit's training procedures, I forwarded his paperwork on with a separate note of support. Pastorelle. The town slept. The countryside slept. The chief engineer of the Department of Nuclear Energy, in his enviable Moscow apartment, slept. It was a clear night in April, one of the most beautiful of the year. Meadows rippled like silvery lakes in the starlight. Pripyat was sleeping. Ukraine was sleeping. The country was sleeping. The chief engineer's brother, Mikhail, was awake, hunting sugar for his coffee. His half-brother Petya was awake, soaking his feet and baiting a hook. In the number 4 reactor of the staff, Mikhail included, was running a test to see how long the turbines would keep spinning and producing power in the event of an electrical failure at the plant. It was a dangerous test, but it had been done before. To do it, they had to disable some of the critical control systems, including the automatic shutdown mechanisms. They shut down the emergency core cooling system. Their thinking, apparently, had been to prevent cold water from entering the hot reactor after the test and causing a heat shock. But who knows what was going on through their minds? Only men with no understanding of what went on inside a reactor could have done such a thing. And once they had done that, all their standard operating procedures took them even more quickly down the road to disaster. The test as idea was half standard operating procedure, half seat of the pants initiative. Testimony, perhaps, to the poignancy of the longing to make things safer. Did Mikhail know better? Even he probably knew better. His main responsibility was the turbines, but even so, did he suspect his colleague's imbecility? One night, as a boy, after a beating, he hauled himself off his bed and pissed into our father's boots, already wet from the river. He'd never suspect, Mikhail told us. Mikhail lived a large portion of his life in that state of mind, in which you take a risk and deny the risk at the same time, out of rage. No one in his control room knew nearly enough, and whose fault was that? Akimov has your sense of humor, he told me once about his boss. It didn't sound like good news for Akimov's crew. Minutes after they began, the flow of coolant water dropped, and the power began to increase. Akimov and his team moved to shut down the reactor, but they had waited too long, and the design of the control rods was such that, for the first part of the lowering, they actually caused an increase in reactivity. South Seas. On the evening of the 1st May of 1986, in Clinic Number 6 in Moscow, I made the acquaintance of two young people, another senior turbine engineer and an electrical engineer. They had beds on either side of Mikhail's. The ward overflowed with customers. A trainee was collecting watches and wedding rings in plastic bags. Everyone was on some kind of drip, but there weren't enough bowls and bins, so people were vomiting onto the floor. The smell was stunning. Nurses with trays skidded around corners. Mikhail was a dark brown, the color of mahogany. Even his gums. When he saw my face, he grinned and croaked. South Seas. A doctor changing his intravenous line explained without looking up that they called it a nuclear tan. I was there partially and in official capacity to investigate what had happened at the last moments. Mikhail said, "Are you weeping?" The investigator is weeping. But his comrades in the nearby beds were unsympathetic. He interrupted his story in order to throw up in a bin between the beds. He'd been in the information processing complex, a room at a few levels below the control room. 2 shocks had concussed the entire building, and the lights had flashed off. The building had seemed to tip into the air, and part of the ceiling had collapsed. Steam and billows and jets had erupted from the floor. He'd heard someone shouting, "This is an emergency," and had pitched himself out into the hall. There was a strobe effect from the short circuits. The air smelled of ozone and caused a tickling sensation in the throat. The walls immediately above him were gone, and he could see a bright purple light crackling between the ends of a broken high-voltage cable. He could see fire, black ash falling in flakes, and red-hot blocks and fragments of something burning into the linoleum on the floor. He worked his way up to the control room, where everyone was in a panic. Akimov was calling the heads of departments and sections, asking for help. You could see the realization of what he'd helped to hitting him. According to the panels, the control rods were stuck halfway down. 2 trainees, kids just out of school, were standing around frightened, and he sent them off to lower the control rods by hand. "The investigator's weeping," my brother said triumphantly again. "This is a great tragedy," I told him, as though chiding him. The other engineers gazed over from their beds. "Oh yes," he said, as though someone had offered him tea. "Tragedy, tragedy, tragedy." When it became clear that he wasn't going to go on, I asked him to tell me more. "We have no protection systems, nothing," he remembered Perevozchnik saying. Their lungs felt scalded. Their bronchioles and alveoli were being flooded with radionuclides. Akimov had sent him to ascertain the amount of damage to the central hall. He'd made his way to the ventilation center, where he could see that the top of the building had been blown off. From somewhere behind him, he could hear radioactive water pouring down the debris. Steel reinforcing beams corkscrewed in various directions. His eyes stung. It felt as though something was being boiled in his chest. There was an acid taste to the steam and a buzz of static on his skin. He learned later that the radiation field was so powerful it was ionizing the air. "Take that down, investigator," Mikhail said. He tried to drink a little water. The maximum permissible dose. At 1:23:58, the concentration of hydrogen in the explosive mixture reached the stage of detonation, and the two explosions Mikhail had felt in the information processing complex destroyed the reactor and the reactor building of Unit Number 4. A radioactive plume extended to an altitude of 36,000 feet. 50 tons of nuclear fuel evaporated into it. Another 70 tons spewed out onto the reactor grounds, mixing with the structural debris. The radioactivity of the ejected fuel reached 20,000 Röntgens per hour. The maximum permissible dose, according to regulations for a nuclear power plant operator, is 5 Röntgens per year. Some rich assholes just lost his job. Petya said the explosions made the ground shake and the water surface ripple in all directions. Pieces of concrete and steel started landing in the pond around them. They could hear the hissing as the pieces cooled. For a while, they watched the cloud billow out and grow above the reactor. By then, the fire was above the edge of the building. Through a crack in one of the containment walls, they could see a dark blue light. "Some rich assholes just lost his job," he remembered remarking to his friend. I assume he meant someone other than his eldest brother. And by then, they'd both begun to feel dreadful. Their eyes streamed tears as they reeled about, so sluggish and disoriented. It took them an hour to traverse the half-kilometer to the medical station. By the time they arrived, it resembled a war zone. The individual citizen in the vanguard. How much difference could an individual bureaucrat really make in a system? That was a popular topic for our drinking bouts. The epic bouts we seemed to require a topic. The accepted wisdom, which tempered our cynicism enough to smooth the way for our complacency, was that with clever and persistent and assiduous work and some luck, the great creeping hulk that was our society could be nudged in this or that direction. But one had to be patient and work within the system and respect the system's sheer size. Because you see, our school directs all their efforts to inculcating industriousness, somewhat successfully, obedience, fairly successfully, and toadism, very successfully. Each graduation produced a new crop of little yes people. Our children learned criticism from their families and from the street.